Well, even if the debt collection bill does find its way to the House floor and passes, it would still need to travel through the Senate. And here's all the work that was done in that chamber today.
Absent: Bonham, Boquist, Finley, Hansel, Hayden, Knope, Linthicum, Robinson, Thatcher, Weber. 18 ayes.
The call is removed. A quorum is not present.
Yeah, so nothing happened. The walkout continues today, and in case you missed our segment yesterday, yes, the senators who are walking out do get paid despite their lack of attendance. And the average daily payment for lawmakers is around $325 a day. But there was a tiny bit of movement towards the possibility of some work getting done. Today, Senate Republicans released an official statement on something that they've sort of been quietly saying. They will return to the chamber on the last day of the session to pass what they call, quote, substantially bipartisan budgets and bills. The last day of this session is June 25th. Their statement went on to say that the budget is the primary reason they would return. But the big question there is, would Senate Democrats even flirt with the possibility of trying to pass a budget in the 11th hour if that's the only thing that Republicans are going to come back for? Senate President Rob Wagner was asked that very question last Thursday.
Would you all refuse absolutely to do that?
Yeah, this weekend I went back and I think I said this at one speech that I gave from the rostrum, and I'm a nerd for Oregon history, and I love to go back and look at media, and I love to go back and I love to watch Olis. Go back and look at the speeches from March 5th from Peter Courtney and from Tina Kotek. That is the standard. When Tina, at the end of her floor speech, said, you don't get to come back with 12 hours left, Leader Drazen, and determine just the bills and the budgets that you want to vote on. Like, that's not what democracy is. And it just isn't. And so the same standard is going to apply here.
In other words, no, that's not going to happen, according to Wagner. And that idea of picking and choosing which bills to vote on is something that investigative reporter Evan Watson asked Senate Minority Leader Tim Knope just last week, after Knope made a point about Democrats choosing which laws to follow, alluding to the readability law that we've told you all about.
You can't just say, like the Democrats have, that we will pick and choose which rules and laws that we're going to abide by.
Now, if you come back on the last day, for example, of the session to vote on a budget or a couple of other things, wouldn't that be pick and choosing which bills you're voting on?
Well, we've always said that I said from the very beginning before the session started that if they wanted to be bipartisan, we're all in for that. If they wanted to, to move a leftist progressive national agenda, we'll fight them every step of the way.
Now, I gotta say, credit where it's due. That was a brilliant pivot right there by the Republican leader. He did not answer Evan's question, not even close. Well, it seems more and more likely that this walkout is nowhere near its end. Governor Kotek could call a special session, of course, for budget work if it fails during the regular session. And there is some light at the end of the tunnel. A bill has been signed to keep the state agencies funded at least until September, but they need a budget passed in order to keep operating after that. Now, let's get some of your thoughts and questions on the walkout. We read your emails and listen to your voicemails every night, so keep them coming. We love seeing them. We've received a number of messages like this one from a viewer who identified themselves as C. The legislative walkout is an attempt to govern from the minority by trying to forcibly impose their extremist views on the majority of Oregonians who voted for something different. These Republicans are undermining our democracy that represents the will of the people, not a manipulative minority. It might sound obvious, but your own perspective, my perspective, our opinions, they actually do play kind of a heavy role in whether we think the tactic of using a walkout is appropriate or not. Nancy told us that was highlighted for her last night.
I was fully on the side of the Democrats when they did the exact same thing that the Republicans are doing here in Oregon. When they did it in Texas, the Democrats walked out. But now I'm totally against the Republicans doing it in Oregon, so it all depends on, I guess, what party you're with.
Thanks for your honesty there, Nancy. Good point. And finally, here's this from Malia. The Republicans are doing their job standing up for what and how the Republicans feel. Can we look up and see how many times the Democrats have done the same thing? I don't believe that they were given this much crap. Let's be fair about this. Both sides have used this method to support their parties. And that is a great point, Malia. So, you know what? Let's dive into the history of walkouts here in Oregon. They have been happening a lot longer than you might think. Let's go back in the Wayback Machine. How about to the year 1860? Yep, just 1 year after Oregon became a state. This nugget came to us from the Oregon Historical Society's Executive Director, Carrie Timchuk. The state legislature met that year to elect U.S. senators. That's something that state lawmakers did until the 17th Amendment passed in 1913. Democrats held a big majority, 35-13 with the Republicans. But Democrats were split into two factions based on candidates that they wanted in Congress. One group was worried the other would team up with those Republicans to elect their favorite candidate. So 6 senators took off and hid in a barn for 2 weeks to, guess what? Prevent a quorum. Oh, yes, they did. The big issue at hand was candidates' views on slavery. The walkout was solved after the governor called a special session that featured negotiations and 18 separate votes. The Democrats who hid in the barn ended up losing. Their candidate was not elected to the U.S. Senate. The next walkout happened more than a century later in 1971. House and Senate Democrats walked out that year. It was prompted by Republicans refusing to consider a federal constitutional amendment to lower the voting age. The walkouts lasted less than a day. Fast forward to 1995. According to the Statesman Journal, some Senate Democrats walked out after Republicans abandoned an award named for a former Democratic state senator. That walkout lasted just a day. Then in 2001, House Democrats walked out over a redistricting bill. Former Governor Kate Brown was the Democratic leader in the Senate at the time. And back then, she called the action of her House colleagues, quote, very appropriate under the circumstances. You'll notice that every walkout from 1860 to 2001 involved Democrats. Of course, the tides have turned, and as Democrats rose to power, the Republicans took the walkout baton and, well, ran with it. In 2007, Senate Republicans walked out for a day because of a tax-related bill. Then Governor Ted Kulongoski sent state police to an Oregon State baseball game in Corvallis to grab 2 senators and force them back to Salem. They went voluntarily. In May of 2019, Senate Republicans walked out for a number of days because of an education funding bill. It ended up passing, but only because Governor Kate Brown reached a deal to set aside other bills on gun control and school vaccines in exchange. Just a month later, in June of 2019, the first Republican walkout over the cap-and-trade plan. Loggers and farmers were worried cap-and-trade, which forced the lowering of carbon emissions, would affect their fuel prices and their jobs. At the time, it didn't have enough Democratic support, and the bill was declared dead. That brings us to February of 2020 and another cap-and-trade walkout. In this case, Republicans agreed to come back for the final day of the session, but only to vote on an emergency budget bill. Sound a little bit familiar, perhaps? A year later, February of 2021, Senate Republicans walked out over COVID restrictions. They were not targeting a certain bill. Instead, they were protesting the actions taken by Governor Kate Brown related to the pandemic. And then later that year, in September, House Republicans walked out over redistricting, accusing Democrats of pushing through a map that favored Democratic candidates. And that brings us to the current walkout, now stretching past 2 weeks with no end in sight. And for those of you keeping score at home, let's make it easy. Since Oregon became a state in 1859, there have been 11 legislative walkouts, including the current one. The first 4 involved Democrats between 1860 and 2001. The last 7 have involved Republicans between 2007 and 2023. Think there's a pattern of who held the majority in the legislature lately? Check out this table showing party control of the House, Senate, and Governor's Mansion for the past 30 years. Quite a blue wave from 2007 to the present. When was the first Republican walkout in Oregon? Oh yes, back in 2007. So, what's going through your mind right now? Any thoughts on the history of walkouts in Oregon? Did it put today's walkout into a little bit of perspective for you? Let us know, will you? The email is thestory@kgw.com or call and leave a voicemail, 503-226-5090.